Our panelists have agreed to limit their speaking to 15 minutes so that there can be maximum question and answer at the end. You note, I speak slowly to help the translators, as well as to note that less is often more. Very briefly, I'd like to mention how I came to this place here in time. 30 years ago, I read a book, Citizen Legislature, that proposed using sortition for the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress. Thereafter, I wrote novels, I wrote screenplays, I've written essays, I've given speeches, even speeches that connect sortition to eventually the abolishment of war. I have most recently written a stage play, which I have put on the tables out here, and I hope that you will take what is here. Professional actors recently did a stage reading, and it led to quite good, deep discussion about sortition. I want to briefly acknowledge the youth contingent. Have you noticed that their questions have been most astute? They have formed an organization called the League of Young Masters. They have prepared for 2 months for this conference studying sortition, and I welcome them heartily as the future, and 30 years from now, I do hope you can say, we did it. I will only be a facilitator beyond this slight, very short introduction. Our first speaker is Alana McTiernan. She's a Member of Parliament in Australia. She was Western Australia's Minister for Planning and Infrastructure, and we'll go straight from her to Ian Walker, who is Executive Director of the New Democracy Foundation in Australia. The foundation conducts real-world trials of innovative democratic processes with elected representatives. Alana?
Thank you very much, David. Now, after the last couple of days, I've sort of began to have some thoughts, well, maybe I shouldn't be up here. You know, we've heard so much about these vile politicians, elected representatives who are all, moe sipping, self-indulgent people that are there to rip off the public. And I must say I am a bit distressed by the theme that has been coming through from so many people that are proponents of a participatory democracy, that they seem to feel that it is absolutely necessary to base the value of this on the lack of value of a representative democracy. And I can tell you, from being inside the system, it feels very, very, very different. As someone like many politicians that actually got involved because we believed, as was spoken yesterday, that we are all crew on planet Earth and that we all have the obligation to get in there and do something. So can I just give this word of advice from my point of view, that this should not be presented as a debate, as a conflict between representative democracy and a way to escape the evils of representative democracy, but rather an enabler of greater democracy generally. Now, I came to this from a very different point of view, as a member being a very active opposition member of Parliament in the 1990s. I'd be going around at rallies and public meetings and, agitating and getting involved and having meetings with groups. And it became more and more evident to me that we had actually created a whole mode of discourse within our public life, that you, in fact, were encouraged, in order to get attention and to promote an idea, you had to actually inflate the wording and the language that you used, because if you were reasonable and moderated and indeed acknowledged that there were complexities in the argument, you wouldn't be getting on the nightly news, you wouldn't be getting in the newspaper. that the whole way in which media was operating, it needed stark contrasts, it needed black and whites. And so that's how people saw the public debate was conducted, and indeed became, in my view, it made lines hardened, and it struck me that we needed to do something about it. And I can remember being in the gym next to Jeanette and saying, look, sometimes I think I just want to get all these people together and lock them in the room and get them to make the decision. And Jeanette said, well, actually, that's what we call participatory democracy, and this is actually how you do it. And I said, well, when we get into government, let's do it. And we did. And we saw this as something that was really going to transform, or had the ability to make our job better and more rewarding. I mean, we, after all, as I said, so many of us in politics get in there because we do believe that we're crude, that we do care about the trajectory of our civilisation. And to unleash that creative ability of the community, we believed was very, very successful. I was going to talk, I had, sorry, which is the button I've got to press here? Very low tech. Sorry. Thank you. We have got a problem in Australia, and there's no doubt about it that we have got an increasing apathy towards politics. And if you look at this recent research, it said that about 65% of people think that democracy is preferable. I mean, that's good, but it means 35% of people are not sure that democracy is the best form of government. And indeed, when we go to 18 to 29-year-olds, we find that less than half believe that democracy is the best system of government. And of those, 45% that said democracy was only serving the interests of a few and not the majority of society. And 36% said they were disillusioned with Australian politics and thought another system might be better. So it was very clear that we cannot leave that apathy unattended. We have to analyse the causes of it, but we also have to do things to turn that around. And we have to take into account the cultural change that is coming with our technological change, a cultural change that is very much about being interactive, being engaged, engaging in collaborative exercises. So what we need to do is to ensure that we are keeping up with the zeitgeist of the times in the way in which we are developing our democratic structures. And I'm very conscious about the time limit here. So I'm going to, I'd really like to go on with some of this philosophy more, but I think perhaps if one of the things that I can do is to talk very constructively about some of the detail of some of the projects that we did. And one of the first one, and I'll give three that are of very, very different orders of magnitude. The first one, we had this big problem in Perth in the 15 years ago, where the size and the length and the volume of road trains, these very, very big 36 to 53 metre vehicles that were coming through cities and country towns was increasing. The government had really adopted pretty much a laissez-faire attitude. Industry was saying they needed this. The farming industry was saying they needed this for their economic future to be competitive internationally, and communities were arcing up about it big time. So what we decided to do was that we would get, and this was our first example, so we got basically, we brought together all of the FOs, the Farmers Federation, the Trucking Association, the Local Government Association, the environmental groups, and the community activist groups that had sprung up to oppose this. And together with a random sample, I think it was about 50-50, the random sample was about 50-50, and the industry and advocacy groups were about 50%. And we brought them all together in a series of series of 4, because it affected rural areas. We had 4 of these forums around the state. Now, before we had the first one, we had such immense opposition from the industry groups, very conservative, Farmers Federation, Pastoralists and Graziers, Truckers Association. Each of them put out a very, very vitriolic press release in the week before, saying that this was a complete sham and this was all just being designed by McTiernan to undermine their industry and to give in to the environmental groups. At the end of the first forum, at the end of the day of the first forum, we saw this most extraordinary turnaround, because for the first time these groups had actually had the opportunity to put their case, to explain their position to the environmental groups, to local government and to the broader community. And they found this immensely satisfying, that they had actually found this process something that was extraordinarily satisfying. I think we saw that theme coming through in some of the earlier presentations. Now, we then took about, out of those forums, we then worked for a year with those groups, with selected groups from each of the forums, to come up with a package. We came up with a package after a year that was, from then on, guided the introduction of road trains onto our roads. We went out and made the announcement. The media came along all excited, and we said, well, we've got a package. This has been agreed by all of the 7 stakeholder groups. They said, well, like, there's no conflict. No, there's no conflict. Well, that's not a story. I mean, the fact that we had taken groups that had been so locked in conflict and turned that around apparently wasn't a story. But it did work very well for us in government and was very effective. We decided the next one was a much bigger, well, this wasn't the next, but perhaps the biggest one that we did, really very empowering as well, was dialogue with the city. We were going through a massive mining boom. Our city was growing very, very quickly. We had to work out how we were going to cope with all this growth. Were we going to have a huge spread of our city? Were we going to try to change the densities? A lot of opposition to density within Australian cities. So we had to work with the community. How are we going to do this? This is a big problem. What are we going to do? The Pol Pot solution wasn't available to us, so we had to work out how to do this. Now, we got together, here was a huge exercise, as I said, some of the collateral bits that involved larger numbers, but then on the big event itself, the big dialogue, which was very much involved in determining what was going to be the shape of the city, what were the key things that we wanted to see with our city, what were we prepared to accept in terms of density, and how did we make that work and preserve amenity and Perth-type lifestyle. A very, very successful process, and I still find from this we did. Sorry, I'll just see if I've got my next one. No, that's it. But from this process, we did actually develop the planning document that then went forward and guided the city growth. I still have people, 10 years after the conclusion of that exercise, I still have people approaching me in the city saying, oh, I was on that panel. It was fantastic. And when the results of the deliberation and the whole development of this notion of a network city emerged, and we had some councils then deciding to kick back against it, it was so interesting, without us coordinating anything. So many of the people that had been involved in that process were there on talkback radio, writing letters to the paper, standing up in front of the television saying that this is in fact the way in which we have to go. This has been a process. They understood the arguments and they were able to go out there and be independent defenders. At the very other end, the wrong one. at the very other end of the scale, we took, sometimes problems are really small and very local. We had extended a highway, and there was a big debate in a local community about which road the highway should be connected to the highway, which one should be disconnected and which one should be connected. And as you can imagine, you had various streets lobbying to have their street to be the one that was closed. So we said, look, this is an issue that we are going to allow you totally to solve. We will have, in this case, a citizens' jury, and the decision that is made by the citizens' jury will be the decision that we implement. And we had, I think it was around 20 people randomly selected. Each interest group, together with Main Roads, had the opportunity to present their case. A decision was made, and everyone was happy with it. And again, I think this has been the note that has come through from before, that in fact even those people whose case is not successful, at the end of the day, if the process is good, are prepared to go away from that process content. Now, Ian's going to talk about that one. We've done some more of these. This process has now been taken up by the South Australian government, and they're doing some really interesting things, enabling them to come up with legislative responses about how they're going to regulate activity in the city, what they're going to do about unwanted pets, and they're planning to go with new processes now, like grappling really hard issues that's very hard for government in Australia to deal with, like what do we do about the storage of nuclear waste, and do we allow the introduction of nuclear energy? These are big projects that are underway. We have a new group formed called in the federal parliament, because there has been no federal government involvement in this area, and we thought it's about that we really need to get this laid. We need to get this in local government, state government, and we really need to get the federal government on board with this way of democratic enhancement. And one of the key issues, and we've been speaking to Ian's group about how we might do this, because one of the issues been almost impossible, and has been in fact impossible for Australian legislators to deal with, is the issue of dying with dignity, or voluntary euthanasia. Every poll tells us that the overwhelming majority of the population support it, but politicians are always really, really reluctant to get involved, because it evokes such strong emotions amongst a minority. So we thought this would be a fantastic opportunity for us to take the sort of issue where, the sort of issue that where the difficulty for the elected official, because they are scared of a small group of people who believe so passionately in one particular position, that if we were able to take this to the public and say that the bill that you come forward with, or the policy that you come forward with, is the policy that we will introduce into the Parliament. Now, we have some unusual capacity to do this, because this is one of those issues that we deal with as conscience vote in Australia. This is not something that people are tied into on party lines. So we can make this commitment that whichever model it is that the community forum would come through with, the sorted model would develop, is the model that we would go forward with. So I think I'm really enthusiastic about really trialling that, and again showing this really important thing about how this is not antithetical to representative government, but how this makes representative government better and stronger. And can I tell you, it takes a little bit of some politicians to get used to this idea. But the reason that we did, as Jeanette said, in our very first one, which was getting other politicians and ministers to be the facilitators, was to get them to actually experience how rewarding this experience is, not only for those that participate in it, but also for the elected representatives, that they have some guidance and strong guidance about how they should take complex and difficult issues forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for this opportunity. It's great to see so much good work going on around the world in this area.
Certainly. Good afternoon. I have a really simple goal in the 15 minutes we have together. I simply hope you'll emerge out the other side and think, we should try this. We should take a small trial. And if you do feel that way, know that an organisation, more than one, exists to help you. If you don't feel that way, take great comfort in the fact that it is impossible to offend an Australian. So I hope you ask the worst and most horrible and harsh questions, because that way we'll develop great new ways to actually get to the bottom of things. Occasionally, I meet politicians who are purists, who believe in this because it's a great thing to do. But more often than not, I'm the last person anyone wants to meet. There's a great phrase, and I hope it translates. It's called, if you want a friend, get a dog. We're not here to be your friends. We're here because this is ruthless pragmatism. There is a limit to politics. Many people do like to criticise elected officials. It's easy, it's throw potshots, throw rocks, but it's pointless. The job can be impossible. You can take the wonderful step of saying, I'm going to give everyone a free chocolate bar. You think you couldn't offend at all. What will you hear? If you have a good opposition, you'll hear from the lactose intolerant, you'll hear from the sugar industry, you will hear from all sorts of people, you'll hear from the Obesity Policy Coalition, no doubt. You can line up opponents to say no to anything. Now, I was absolutely cheered up when Dr. Sarah Galdine opened proceedings with probably a better piece of evangelism than I am able to do on this topic. But for a couple of days, it's a concept. And in the time I have with you, I want to give you a sense that we design, we operate, we oversee. So I'm going to tell you a short and vaguely horrible story of why these projects really happen in practice. Now, this starts at the City of Melbourne. It's the second largest city in Australia, and I hope their story is familiar particularly to the front row. I got approached by the Chief Financial Officer of the city. The city spends about $400 million a year. Of that, about 255 is local taxes. That's the amount they can play with. When they looked at their 10-year financial forecasts, they were a little bit overspent because they'd had local government elections where 13 different councillors running for office had quite naturally promised things that their constituents would want. One group of constituents wanted an urban forest which would replace every tree in the city. Guess how much that would cost? $575 million. Now, do you think as part of that promise it was suggested how it would pay for it? General revenue. Now, there was another group of councillors running who had promised to redevelop 2 shopping precincts, very important in the core of a city. That too was to come from general revenue, $280 million. Other politicians had led with the idea of cycleways, absolutely wonderful things to add to a city. It's okay. It'll come from general revenue. It's no surprise it was the Chief Financial Officer who called us. We've got a little bit of a problem. We're overspent. That's okay. How far overspent? 1.22 billion. So we see here today that the concepts that are trialled, we got the chance to test this because the choice facing our elected officials was invidious. Do you want to walk away from your campaign promises? Or do you want to raise your local taxes 45%? It's a horrible choice. If you take any combination of those choices, I think everyone here can write the headlines that appear tomorrow. And they came to us simply with, what do we do? In practical terms, our first step is a conversation, a closed-door conversation, where we explain the workings of what you've seen here. I'm going to expose a group of citizens chosen by fate. I'm going to ask them an open question. How can we live within our means? Too often, I would suggest, democracy can be a wish list. And the world is one of trade-offs. We have no view. I didn't care if that group of citizens doubled taxes or closed the council. We simply had a view that a group of people freed from the rigours of having to face every newspaper every day, would have fewer impairments on their judgment. We work to 5 principles: time, information, authority, random selection, and critically a blank sheet of paper. I run the slowest and most expensive deliberative processes around. But if you're facing a $1.2 billion funding gap, you don't mind if we take 5 or 6 months to do it. I took 43 citizens that I'd picked completely at random, and I faced a great deal of scepticism from some of the councillors. There's only one proof point. Come along, sit in the back of the room. Tell me if on the range of views, that bell curve of views, and I think many elected officials get subject to, in any distribution of views, the 2 ends. One end which says, you absolutely have to do this or the world will end, and the other end that says, the world will end if you do what they want. When I sampled, I got people from all across that. And I said, I'm not interested in your different views. I'm interested on what you can agree on. Because common ground presented to an elected official is far more powerful than the polar opposite views where you get handed two opposites and said, here you go, we've heard the views, find me a solution. It's not constructive. My writing brief from the former premiers who support what we do, people who've held elected office and see how hard it is simple. Make it easier for leaders to lead. What we saw with that council was an initial fear that they were going to be subjected to more public opinion. Public opinion is garbage. I don't care what you think in the next 30 seconds. I care what you think in around about 50 to 100 hours of being immersed in a topic and having had to discuss and make trade-offs with the people next to you. Public judgment is a completely different thing to public opinion. When the council initially speak to you, they think, can you do this in a couple of weekends? No. If you want citizens to actually get immersed in a topic, I need 4 or 5 months. Now, it seems like an immense amount of time. Think of the complexity of what they were being given. Secondly, we said, in terms of information, you're opening everything up. If it can be the subject of a freedom of information request, then it's in. And more pragmatically, once you've started doing this, surely you're here because you want an answer. Now, the key to this information is I want you to express the city's entire budget in units of $500,000 to $5 million. They said, well, we have an annual report. Yet the annual report, it's not intelligible to a reasonable human being. I understand accountants love them, but real-world people, we said, just tell us what we do. Now, with time, information, authority, what was critical is we gave them a blank sheet of paper. Very often, government will consult by saying, here's our draft plan, and what do you get back? You get it thrown back at you. And the analogy I'd encourage you to think about is, maybe you've ever told your child he needs to go to the dentist, what kind of response you might get. No one wants to go to the dentist. Stop telling people they need to go to the dentist. If you pose them a question and say, how do you plan to have teeth when you're 70? Let them go away, let them work it out for themselves. They might choose to speak to other people. They might choose to research a bit of scientific information. They'll probably come back with a balance of measures that say, well, I'll eat less sugar, I'll brush my teeth, I should probably go to the dentist. Let them solve the problem. And from our point of view, instead of councillors having to stand in front of horrible solutions, they were empowering citizens to say, solve it your way, as long as you solve it. I want to jump ahead a bit because the core and operations have been covered in some detail. It's always the ugly part that people want to know about. What did citizens do? Now, firstly, there's a significant, in Australia, mistrust of experts. There's a phrase I hope mirrors around. You can find an expert to say anything. If you want to build a road, I can find you an expert that says it will develop the economy of the region. I can find you another expert that says it's going to kill a golden bell frog and our biodiversity will be threatened and you can't build the road. We let citizens themselves simply answer the question, what do you need to know and who do you trust to inform you? There is no perfect information. There is simply information people trust. Having gone through this process, citizens took on a range of measures. Yes, they privatised some assets. They recommended a change to local taxes of 5.5% per year, every year, for 10 years. Now, it's a revenue measure that will raise $770 million. When we looked at the history of the City of Melbourne, for the last 12 years, in 8 years, they raised taxes 0. Hey, you're running for office. That's a fantastic thing to do. In the other 4 years, they moved at less than CPI. Now, I'm not advocating that raising taxes is a great reason to do this, but all councillors agreed there was a problem. You could not keep living with a funding gap of north of $1 billion. We saw citizens come back with a range of measures. Now, when the council ultimately voted about 5 months later, they raised taxes 4.2%. And a journalist contacted me and says, isn't that a failure for your group? Because the jury came back at 5.5% and the council only moved at 4.2%. And the response I gave is the one I'd like you to take away. The council, the elected group's range of options was so narrow. Anywhere they moved, they would be criticised. By having a jury stand in front of the decision, go in the papers and say, this is hard and we have the solutions, they stood shoulder to shoulder with the elected representatives. And that narrow range of permissible actions extended. And part of the magic of this is that it's very hard to ascribe wicked intent to a group of everyday people. You can name any single action group or lobby group and they're their guys. They're aligned to my opponent. We've had occasionally an elected official try to pick on a jury and you can see they very quickly realise, this looks a lot like a group of voters. And that's an interesting sentiment when you start to broaden what is available. In short, as I listened to what unfolded over the last couple of days, a figure jumped out at me. It was actually the debt of Egypt, which I heard had gone through £2.2 trillion. What a great chance to ask a question, how can we live within our means? I suggest that with the greatest of intent, and too many people do criticise elected representatives, the task of closing that £2.2 trillion debt is impossible. There's a fantastic quote from Jean-Claude Juncker, who is the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, and sing along if you know it. But he said, we all know what to do. We just don't know how to get elected after we've done it. This is the reason to see a jury model as a complementary solution, because having everyday people stand alongside you, we're probably never going to cure citizens of being cynical about the elected class. But having people like me, having everyday people stand alongside them and saying, back off, give them a break, actually gives the running room to make considered decisions and not decisions based on a headline. I'm amazed that hasn't beeped. If I've got 3 minutes to go, I'll go 32. No, I'm just kidding. Very simply, when should you start to think this is a fit? No one should ever evangelise a silver bullet. My first day in this job, we're backed by two respected former premiers in Nick Greiner and Jeff Gallop, one of the right, one of the left. And they both said the same thing to me. You know where to start? You start with the least trusted areas of public discourse, of public policy. Crime, tax, urban planning. If there's ever anything where you want to draw a large bullseye on you as an elected representative, they're the areas to go after. We're a little less well suited to pure values conversations because the real transformation, the trigger test that we use is, will someone's 30-second view differ from their 50-hour view? Everyone can tell you what they want in 30 seconds. I want better services and lower taxes. That's not particularly useful. It's when they make the trade-off and get beyond the wish list that we can deliver you something useful. I heard earlier, and the one point it's just jumped out at me, some of the conversation has been, have we got a problem with democracy? Look at the attempt to put it down in Iraq, to implement and put something on the ground. 8% of Americans think Congress does a good job. Consider when you pick up your phone and look at TripAdvisor for a restaurant. You look at the restaurant and it says, oh, 92% of people got food poisoning here. We must eat there. The equivalent is the same. Learn from the mistakes of the West. There's no need to repeat them. There's a fabulous opportunity. And there's a great analogy for this. For many years, there was not a great deal of telephony across Africa. When eventually money and investment came, Africa did not repeat putting copper wires and poles across the continent. They skipped a generation and they went straight to mobile phones. Why on earth would you look at 100 years of what's transpired and think, well, let's put those copper wires up all over again and go through that pain? There is a chance, and I would say it's a pretty appealing chance, that if you can deploy at a small scale a deliberative model, you'll get the greatest opportunity on earth. One that I think might appeal to Farida most of all. If you build a democracy better than the EU and the United States, you get to tell a few people to get stuffed. There is a chance to do this. I work for a pragmatic organisation. We get asked to deploy things on the ground. There are barriers with literacy. It is a huge challenge. Start small and simple. City budgets are very understandable for local citizens. Literate, illiterate, they can understand. They live here and they break the one wonderful thing that can be the difference and can be a challenge with electoral democracy. For citizens, it's their money. Sometimes running for office, you get to spend other people's money. So if you start with a city-level project and it works, there's nothing that maybe extends the idea like success. So with that, I really appreciate your attention, and I want to give you one quote that Dr. Sarah Geldine, it was passed to me by the lovely lady sitting next to me. It was a George Bernard Shaw quote. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. I know a few of you started as skeptics. I hope you end thinking a trial is not such a bad idea. Thank you.
Okay, I hope we have a lively discussion period after all of those provocative ideas. We have. Is everyone convinced? Yes, please, Jeanette.
It's a question, Alana, I probably should have asked about 7 or 8 years ago. But why do you think that so few politicians are really willing to take this on? If it's so obvious, and it obviously was to you, why isn't it so obvious to others that this can really help them do their job?
Well, I don't think most people are like our friend here from Uruguay and just completely opposed to it. I actually think probably the biggest problem is that most politicians aren't actually aware of it. I would say that within our federal parliament, there were very, very few, and these are highly, a couple of hundred highly politically engaged people who many of whom are very, very familiar with all the latest techniques, with social media, all of the technological possibilities of engagement through digital technology. But I honestly don't believe that these ideas have actually penetrated the political class very much. And indeed, that's and it's great that we've got the universities and New Democracy, and part of I see my role, particularly in the federal parliament, is trying to get exposure to these ideas so people actually start seeing this as a possibility.
Jeanette, I think there's a lead time to being seen as a safe pair of hands. We had to start with tiny projects, very small civic budgets, and get larger, and then work for a parliamentary committee, a Senate committee, a minister, a premier. Now multiple premiers work for you. It's a little easier to tell the story. And when the success, when the change to the city budget, the fix of the deficit lands in the Melbourne Age, so in your New York Times, in that equivalent, that lets them think, hang on, it's not just good policy, it's good politics. There's a really nice saying, we had an elected mayor who commissioned our work, have a very good election result. And he laughed and he said, no one understands what you do, but they see people like them making decisions and they love it. I'm just the guy who lets them do it. If you can do that and actually get hard problems solved, what's not to like? But you have to earn your way in, and we've just been doing hard yards for a decade.
And I think forums like this, where the examples from around the world are collected, and that just gives then a greater repository of success, which gives people some confidence of taking this forward. We did have a bit of a setback in Australia, quite unfortunately, during a highly contested election, that a Prime Minister said that rather than making a very hard decision about carbon pricing, we'll put it to the citizens' jury. Now, that was just met with complete derision, and unfortunately it did set the cause back a little, because these are not the sorts of things that I think can be made, part of a highly partisan process. They really have to be established in calmer waters.
Okay. Professor van Ginkel.
Thank you very much. I am very inspired by the presentations during the whole day. And I'm pretty sure that deliberative democracy is some complementarity in the whole system. But at the same time, I'm also kind of a little bit amazed about the simplicity of the topics that have been handled. And this all works in Australia, where you have very large municipalities and you can do much in one municipality, or when you only go to the national government level. But in more densely populated countries, you encounter also other types of problems. And that is about the competition between local authorities. Competition between local authorities in relatively small units. I was myself directly involved in the early 90s in Utrecht. And it was about creating an improved physical infrastructure plan for the central part of the Netherlands, for the country very important, because it's really the heart of the country. All the major roads, all the major railway tracks, everything is crossing there. So it's a high density of high-level transport connections. And you need to have real estate, you need to have industrial estates, new locations for housing, because it's the most densely populated part of the country, and it's the most densely populated country almost anyway. So what do you do? And there was a major conflict between the big city and 12 surrounding municipalities, and it's quite clear the plan had to encompass all of them. And each municipal authority wanted to have different things. And so I got a telephone call by the Chamber of Commerce whether I would be prepared to chair the meeting between the mayors and the aldermen of these cities, of these municipalities, 12, and the province, and also the relevant ministries at the national level. So what you have to do is not just to get the citizens and the elected governing people together. You also have to bring these different authorities of these different entities together at the same time. Okay. And they have also civil servants serving them. They also have ideas. And for them it's very easy to throw sand into the machine. So you have to really reach out to those people. It's communication. And the major message in all of this, also what you are telling, is the preparedness of those elected to reach out to the others, to find joint solutions that can be agreed upon by all of them. And we were successful. It took 4 or 5 years, and then we had a physical infrastructure plan for the whole area, which was adopted by all the municipal councils, which was not opposed by the citizens, which was implemented by the civil servants, which was agreed by the provincial government and by the national ministries. So within a very few months, the approvals at the higher levels also came. And that's what I would like to say here. It's good to improve democracy, it's good to bring in new instruments, but we should be flexible because all situations are different. and we should all the time look for the best solution under the given circumstances.
Hans, your question was longer than my talk, so you got to make more points than me. But to go to your point, it's actually easier in a dense environment. The challenge with Australia, I need to get people there all day. The project we have stuffed up is because we took on far too large a geographic area. I would love to take on a super dense city because people only have to travel a short distance. I took on an agricultural project in South Australia. It is...
No, the time is not the travel, the time is the discussion.
But you've got to get them there to the discussion, Hans. If I'm covering 500 kilometres, they don't teleport there. But to go to your point, you said you took on easy topics. I want the whole front row to tell me that civic budgeting and deficits is an easy topic. I think your statement is completely wrong. It's the hardest topic on earth because everyone wants the next free thing announced. Everyone wants to go to heaven and no one wants to die. Well, unfortunately, there's a reality of trade-offs that does not exist. To go to your point, though, a preparedness of city officials, some come to me because they just say there's a better way of doing things and I'm interested. But mostly it's because the wolves are at the door. The City of Melbourne didn't come to me because they loved me. They came to me because the bankers weren't that far away. We've had contact from accounting firms who look at this, they've seen our local examples and they say, governments will listen to you when the IMF is the next port off the door. That's fine. No, but what a great reason to do it. Don't ask me out because I'm the prettiest girl at the dance. Ask me out because I'm the only one there. That's fine. If I get the chance to prove I can dance, it's enough. So I'm sorry, I just hold a different view to you.
But Hans, look, I'm not sure that we're necessarily that far apart. One of the examples that I gave, which was the dialogue with the city, which I think was the sort of complex issue that you were talking about, that involved 30 local councils. And you're right that you have to be adaptable in your mechanisms. And what we did in this case, that we did actually include the local governments in the process with the randomly selected individuals, and that ended up working really well. So we had representatives of all of the 30 local governments, as well as the randomly selected people working together on that plan, because that actually enhanced buy-in in something as complex as that. So I do think...
We are relatively close, you know.
Yes.
And I don't understand the reaction of I anyway. But I think the issue is to be flexible, to be adaptable, not go for a one solution in all cases. That's the point.
Gary Jacobs says he's had a 10. Thank you. I'd like to thank both of you for really excellent presentations and exciting presentations, and that's to the earlier speakers too, because I agree with Hans that today has been really exciting already. I'd like to just put a question for either of you to respond. What I'm hearing, I think the message that's trying to come out here, and maybe that's your intention or maybe that's Ishmael's intention, I don't know, goes way beyond citizen jury. At least that's what I'm getting. It communicates to us that democracy is not a thing. Democracy is an evolving system which has hundreds of decision points and ways in which it can be made better, and you're giving us some very dramatic, real case studies of that. So my question back to you is, going beyond the citizen jury and the deliberative budgeting and all, what do you see as the wider potential for a reframing or recreation or evolution or whatever you want to call it of democracy to really make it work much more effectively than it does today? How great do you see because you're involved with it, how great do you see the opportunities to really make this system work better?
Yeah, look, I think you're totally right that democracy is about a spirit of actually sharing power and working together to develop solutions, whether it's representative or participatory. And if I can just give one little story, and I think it's a John Gaskell story. It's a piece of research that they did in the US, where voting is voluntary. They looked at voting patterns before people served on juries and after they served on juries. And there was this incredible, it was a big longitudinal study, and a really very significant change in behaviour. You were much more likely to vote after you had served on a jury. And they then did the analysis. And why was that so? It was because people had started to see themselves as decision makers, and they had started to actually understand their responsibility. They had understood how difficult decision making is. And so by being actually involved in that process, actually enhanced their capacity and their desire and their commitment to a philosophical principle or system of government that is built on every citizen participating in being a decision maker in some way, whether it's at the ballot box or in a direct way. So I really see this whole process as being part of building restoring an interest in democracy, and even in the representative part of democracy, becoming more engaged in how you make your decision at the ballot box, as well as the decisions that you've given the opportunity to make elsewhere. And it's how you transform it from a retail experience to a wholesale experience is one of the challenges of participatory democracy.
Gary, the short holy grail answer that I'll give you, and I can be a little more adventurous than Atlanta in some respects because I'm fortunately backed by someone who could probably buy New Zealand if he wanted to, so we don't have to worry sometimes about the realities of getting billed and getting things through. I look at the United States, and I think our sessions actually started with this notion of the American budget shutdown. Now, you've got an elected Congress, an elected lower house, an elected Senate. Now, they have some incentives to disagree with each other. They have to run for congressional elections every 2 years. Looks good to kick the other guy. And we see the format of that. If you had a third house, just a release valve, just a group of people drawn just for this purpose, and 90% of people agreed with one or other of the proposals emanating. If a group of citizens heard, actually 90% of a group of everyday people agree with X, then I think the wider public is inclined to agree with that as well. Moreover, the presence and the knowledge that short-term, headline-driven, Trump-esque arguments are actually going to get subject not to 30 seconds of scrutiny, but detailed scrutiny, will actually limit the worst excesses of it. So in some element, a release valve, and I just try to always emphasise two words, complementary, pragmatic. That's all we're really seeking is an institutionalised mechanism that says this is a great way to get a representative group of people involved. Maybe, just maybe, make it a little easier for those who hold elected office.
Yeah, I'm sorry, could we close it? I've got 3 messages that we're at the end. Prime Minister, I don't know if you can be very short to close.
Definitely short, because we are all tired, including myself.
Yeah.
I mean, so since we are in library, which is recording everything, just for the reference, for the footnote, I think there is one thing, if we are talking about such a great changes, which are really great changes, I mean, I think we should just put the footnote that we have to open debate or do something with leadership for these changes. The issue of leadership is becoming, I mean, this is all going to be academic discussion without proper follow-up, which includes strongly different leadership for this issue and leadership that will be, let's say, producing the new 21st century democracy. Because today, and I'll stop with this just to have an evidence, there is an excellent report by Global Council Global Development Council run by Al Gore, which publicized extremely interesting report, which is saying that on the top of the problems of today's globe, after inequality and jobless growth, there's lack of leadership and absolute trust globally. There is no leadership because 86% of the people think that we have a leadership crisis in the world. And to be very precise, NGOs are much better than politicians when it comes to the trust. That's it.
Thank you. I think Professor Sarah Galdin had a proposal from the floor earlier that actually some follow-up workshop, I don't know what, to make this real, might happen. I don't know how that progresses. In any case, remember, I have my play, and it's out there, and please take it, and thank you very much.